Welcome, everybody, to Montefalco, called the Balcony of Umbria. Tonight we're going to be celebrating fine wines, not only fine foods, textiles, and Renaissance majesty. I would just like to say this. Most of you already know who I am. For anybody who's new to our groups this evening, my name is Anne Robichaud. In spite of a French-Canadian surname, I have lived in Italy for over 50 years. No, I don't feel Italian. I'll always be American, but this is not a country which is foreign to me anymore. I live in the countryside outside of Assisi. My husband is originally from Palermo, Sicily. We farmed for many years. On my virtual experiences page, you can see all my talks, and you may enjoy watching Umbrian rural life revisited, the days of working the land here in Umbria. I'm now a guide, and COVID has very much impeded my work as a guide and launched me into this second work of presenting Umbria virtually rather than on site. So let's talk about Montefalco and see it and enjoy it together virtually until you can all come and visit it on site. It is called the Balcony of Umbria, la ringhiera dell'Umbria. The word ringhiera actually means the railing around a balcony. And from any point in Montefalco, looking down a medieval alleyway, this is the main entrance, Porta Sant'Agostino, which we'll see later. Looking down any of these alleyways, you get magnificent views of the surrounding countryside. So this is the Balcony of Umbria. The town is surrounded by vineyards. Many of the vineyards are of the Sagrantino grape. The Sogrentino is a red grape indigenous to this area. It is autochthonous, meaning it can only be grown in a 22 square kilometer area of Umbria. In the area around Bevagna, Montefalco, Giano dell'Umbria, Gualdo Cattaneo, four small towns. And the name Sagrantino probably comes from the word sacro, because it's so highly tannic. It was probably used for many centuries as a mass wine. It will be cultivated and bottled as a table wine in the 1960s, thanks to the Arnaldo Caprai family, and now it is famous. It's one of the top 5 reds in the nation. Here are the splendid Sagrantino vineyards surrounding Montefalco. And as mentioned, if you look down any of the side streets of Montefalco, as you wander, you get splendid views of the valley area around Montefalco. These are the winding back streets of this small town where just about 5,500 people live. It is really more a village than a town. It's famous for its wines. It's famous for its textiles, woven on looms, both linen and cotton. I have a Montefalco textile right behind me. This one is done in tones of green. This was a gift from a very special friend. During the wine week at the end of September, many of the shops of Montefalco display textiles, which are highlighted with the motif of grapes. Bunches of grapes, intertwining grapevines, grape leaves. And the shops are displaying the textiles, again, with the motif of the Sagrantino grapes, particularly these colors of Sagrantino. I tried to wear a Sagrantino color tonight as much as I could, and I told dear host Rick tonight, you'll see him again later, Rick, you wore your Sagrantino shirt just for tonight. There he is, look at him. He's dressed to the nines in Sagrantino, and he didn't even know it, I guess, right, Rick? We should go out together tonight. We'd be a nice matching couple. And so here you see the word tessitura, which means textiles of Montefalco. Aren't they splendid? When Pino and I went to the Enologica, the wine festival, at the end of September, we drove up to Montefalco on this beautiful road up to the hill, surrounded by vineyards of the Montefalco grapes. We passed wine cellars that were open for savories of wines by guests, wine tastings, also for the sale of the wines, obviously, and winery and vineyard tours. Look at the spelling, vineyard tour. Don't you love it? Winery and Vineyard tour. And we parked our car right here, and I went in just to see, you know, the wine tasting. This is the son of the owner of this winery and some of his guests. These people are from northern Italy, enjoying the Sagrantino wine, enhanced with tasty little tidbits. Bruschetta with black truffle pate, bruschetta with porcini mushroom pate, and the wonderful toasted bread of Umbria dipped into their olive oil. And they were having just a delightful time. And this again was at the Veneranda La Cantina, meaning wine cellar. Veneranda, note the name because we're going to run into it again. We arrived at Montefalco. We parked our car outside of the 13th century city gate, Sant'Agostino. Please notice the battlements. These battlements are what we call swallowtail battlements. The battlements will tell the allegiance of the town. These are Ghibelline battlements, signifying fidelity to the feudal emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor. In fact, Frederick II came here to hunt the peregrine falcons in the Montefalco area. He's the grandson of Frederick Barbarossa. Part of his childhood was spent in the fortress of Assisi, and it is said that he was baptized in Assisi in the Cathedral of San Rufino, where Francis and Clare were baptized. There's Pino checking out the poster, announcing this event called Enologica, this wine event. Enologica Abbinamenti, wine event pairings, wine tastings paired with artistic events, food events, musical events, 3 days of actual splendor and good times. You enter into the Sant'Agostino gate and you're in Montefalco. Walk up the one main street on the right and on the left, a little trattorie or ristoranti, wine shops offering tastes of wine. There's a wine barrel outside with bottles on top and a couple glasses, and the owner of the shop is inside. You can taste the wine, and if you'd like to buy it, you may buy it. There's even ice cream with Sagrantino in it. This ice cream was cheesecake al Sagrantino ice cream. I tasted it. It didn't really attract me. I ended up with my usual favorite, which is, I think, hazelnut. And I'm outside the gelateria in one of the beautiful back streets of Montefalco. Right near the gelateria is the 13th century church, Augustinian, dedicated to Sant'Agostino. And it's a Gothic church. It is in need of great restoration. There are some frescoes inside. We won't be talking about them today because we have to center our talk on another set of frescoes we want to specifically talk about. And Sant'Agostino has a cloister adjacent to it. And around this cloister, the monks could walk, pray, meditate. It's been restored, and it is adjacent to the refectory, which is right over here. And in that refectory, there was wine tasting. 17th, 18th, 19th of September, the Enologica. And there were wine representatives from the various vineyards around Montefalco offering tastes of wine. As I looked at the people, I imagined Augustinians sitting at the tables in that refectory centuries before, enjoying good food, and some of the local Sogrentino themselves. So here's some of the tastings going on. This is actually the woman from the winery La Veneranda offering some of their wines. That was the winery we passed on our way up. Now, when we went in, Pino got his wine goblet. You can see them on the necks of all these people here, their little wine bags. Printed on the bag in red is Strada del Sagrantino, the road of the Sagrantino. They're enjoying their wine, aren't they? And right here, they're tasting the reds. This is probably a Sagrantino. So Pino purchased his goblet for €10. And after you have your goblet, you wear it in your little sack, and you can wander all these stands and taste as many wines as you wish. And here's the poster. 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th of September. As you enter here, this is the entryway into the refectory. On the right, on the wall, by the way, I did not get a glass, a goblet. I did not have to pay the entry fee because I had told the girls I wouldn't be able to drink the wine and enjoy it, but I'd like very much to write about the wine week and to talk about it on my presentation. And the girls said, please, please come in as our guest. Your job is only to record your memories and take your photographs. So it was very nice. So I was the accompanier to the wine taster here. On the wall to the right, posters, enticing posters, different restaurants sharing their secret recipes of foods incorporating the Sagrantino. This is actually a dish of squab, and it's cooked in Sogrentino. This is a fish from Lake Trasimeno, and the sauce is the Sagrantino wine. The posters were absolutely enticing. Then you enter into the cloister area. Pino's tasting his first wine, and he's tasting the Trebbiano Spolettino. That's a white wine. It's typical of the area. These grapes are produced on the hills of Trevi, Spoleto, Montefalco, this general area. And here's the posters here of all the different foods as you entered, because we entered right around this way. And she's telling them about the Trebbiano, the aging process, and so forth. And actually, for this year at Enologica, Pino decided to concentrate just on the whites. In the past, he'd often tasted, we both had, Montefalco Rosso and the Sagrantino, but this year he just stuck with the whites. So he's tasting a Trebbiano Spolettino. Then we went into the cloister area, into the refectory area, pardon me. And this young woman from a winery called the Tenuta Alzatura is offering Pino a sip of their Trebbiano and explaining to him all about the history of the grape, the cultivation, because they give you a lot of information as you taste the wines. And we were asking her, what is the production like this year? And she told us it's down 50%. And it's down 50% because of the freeze we had in early April. And that caused great damage to the vineyards. So what she told us was there'll be excellent wine, but the quantity is very limited. And as we talked, and I was asking her questions, she suddenly said to me, "Ma Anna, non mi riconosci? Anna, don't you recognize me?" And I said, "No, that mask, no." And she said, "Well, I'm vaccinated. Are you?" And I said, "I am." Pino could have his off because he's tasting. All the servers had to have theirs on. And I said, "If you take off your mask and I can see who you are, I'll stand over a meter away." That's the regulation. She took off her mask and I just roared, "This is Ombretta." And she is sommelier at a restaurant in Bevagna where I often used to book lunches for my tour guests if we did a Bevagna tour. And she's just hooting, "It's me, it's me." Pino's laughing too because he remembered Ombretta. She's no longer sommelier at that little trattoria, which has alas closed, and now she is sommelier for this winery. So we had a few good laughs with Ombretta, and of course we had to buy a bottle of her wine. This Tenuta Alzatura produces above all Sagrantino and Montefalco Rosso. The Sagrantino is 100% Sagrantino grape. The Montefalco Rosso is 70% Sangiovese grape and about 10% Sagrantino, and then up to 20% another red grape, probably the Merlot. But she was also selling Trebbiano Spolettino, and I believe this was a winery with whom they work. This is the Trebbiano Spolettino. And at the next table, we were tasting the wine. We wanted to taste the wine of the Veneranda vineyard, also because we were astounded to see a Rosato of Sagrantino, a Sagrantino Rosé. This was being served by the sommelier. Actually, she was the daughter of the owner of Veneranda, and I believe her name was Flavia, if I remember. And as she poured Pino some of the rosato, she told him this. Or her name was Valeria, excuse me, Valeria. She told Pino this. This wine is produced by picking our, this is a quote from her, by picking our Sagrantino grapes prior to full ripening, so as to give us the freshness of a white wine and the body of a top red. This is the first time in all of our years in Umbria that we had ever seen Sagrantino produced as a rosato, a rosé. It was very tasty. I even had a sip of that, and Pino bought a bottle of it. And we learned later that there are other wineries that, besides producing Sagrantino with their grapes, are also producing this rosata. So we left with now 2 bottles of Trebbiano, 1 bottle of rosato. Well, we had people we had to give gifts to, so that was a good excuse. And then we stopped at the table of a delightful young man who was most enthusiastic about speaking about his family's wines. And his name is Fabio Conti. You can see his name on the poster. The wine is that he's calling it the De Conti wines. The wine has been sold since 1982. Fabio told us that he does this work of cultivating their wine and bottling it per passione, only for passion, he said, not for earning a living, because we only have 2 acres, he told us, and only about 3,000 bottles are we able to produce each year. They have only about, I don't know how many vines they have, but I do know they have 27 vines which grow up around the trees. I'm going to show you that in a minute. The tree called the Madre dell'Uva. And their vines are 100 years old. And Fabio told us that his grandfather, Nonno Battista, had worked the vineyard for many years, and now Fabio and his father Dino are producing the wine. Now, on their wine estate, they have 27 vite maritate, which means vines which are married. This vine is married to a tree. This tree is the European maple. It's pruned, its branches go out this way, so the vine can grow around it. This tree is often called by our farm neighbors in the 1970s, they would tell us it was called La Madre dell'Uva, the mother of the grapevine. Some of you heard my talk, Rural Life Revisited in Umbria, and in that talk I showed the Madre dell'Uva that we have on our property. These are our trees, and they were planted by Povero Gianetto, dear Gianetto, the man who built our house in the 1920s. He died in the 1960s, and he had a vineyard up on the hill. But this was typical of people who had small plots of land like ours, only 8 acres here. They would plant trees in the middle of the fields where they planted wheat, oats, barley, and hay. The oxen could work the fields up and down in the middle of the trees. And this was a way to get more grapes out of your land. Extremely clever, isn't it? I mean, extra grapes guided by these mothers of the grapevines, La Madre dell'Uva. See how they're pruned? We call this brutally pruned. Their arms stick out, so the grapes are lifted to the sun. We talked to Fabio for a long time. Pino asked him, what grapes are on your vines, on your 27, vines growing around the trees? He said, we're not sure. Pino said, well, you're agronomist. You're not able to identify the grape. He says, è molto complicato. It's very complicated. Pino said, I'm not sure what grapes we have, and I'd like to know. Could you identify them? He said, I can try for you. First, I need to see the grapes when they're born in early June and then close to harvest time. but I'm not sure that I can define it. He said, I've worked with agronomists at the University of Perugia on trying to identify our grapes. So isn't that something? We have these grapes, we can only call them red or white because we're not sure of the denomination of the grapes. But before we left, Pino and Fabio had an appointment for him to come to our land next June and see our grapes as they're born, and then he'll come back in the fall and we'll try to identify the grapes. Before we left, we looked out over the valley below and the St. Augustine Gate where we had entered Montefalco. And then we walked through the town, and wine was the theme. This door is hanging around in front of the door, all wine corks. Wine corks frame the sign. This is a delightful sign. This says, "Cercasi clienti anche senza esperienza." Clients desired, even those without experience. And look at the stop sign, you know, stop here and come on. On another trattoria, boxes were on the railing entering, and the boxes contained 2 bottles of wine. One of Rosso of Montefalco, which contains some Sagrantino, and one of Sogrentino, which is pure Sagrantino grape. Only €27 for 2 bottles. And in front of this shop, there was a chair, a delightful chair, seating for 2, made of a wine keg. We later met the artist who made this. Look at the pillow. It's the color of Sogrentino. In front of another shop, a wine keg was cut in half, and half of it was affixed to the wall. The shutters were covered with crates of wine broken up, and these are the names of all the wineries on these shutters. So going through Montefalco, the theme was wine. This is a tabletop hanging outside of another shop which sold maiolic inside. This is by the famous artist of contemporary ceramics, Roberto Domiziani. He's from Deruta. The theme is grapes. Grapes, bunches of grapes, the vines, the leaves, and so forth. These 2 young men are tasting wine outside of a shop, and the wine is offered to them sitting on a keg. The shop owner is in here. He'll come out later and say, you know, are you enjoying the wine? Would you like another one? Would you care to purchase one? Across the street, we went into this shop because hanging outside were some very attractive, very beautiful, really, cutting boards, curved, different shapes. We were extremely curious. We went in and we met the artist, Mastro Fabio. Here he is. And he was showing us this. His cutting boards are made of staves of wine kegs. He buys old wine kegs and cuts them up, and absolutely beautiful because they had this red hue. And he said it's due to the fact that in this wine keg there were the Sagrantino grapes aging. So they gave this beautiful color to the wood. Absolutely lovely objects. Pino was very intrigued by 2 cutting boards, the shapes. He said, what are these from? And he said, I took a piece of a wine press and cut it in half. These objects behind Pino are very intriguing as well, and I think I have a photo of one. These are some of the cutting boards. This is to hold wine bottles. And this man was so clever. What he used here were the hoops of the wine kegs. Isn't that something? So we left the wine day enologica with our wines, Trebbiano, Rosato, walking down the streets of Montefalco. There's Pino. He's got his mask off because we're outdoors. And as we left, we looked out at the view. And, you know, here's the view from the Balcony of Umbria. We're looking across the valley at Assisi right here, Spello right here, Bevagna down here. And this is Valle Umbra Nord, the largest valley in Umbria. Let's remember that only 6% of Umbria is valley. The rest is hill and mountain. That morning, we had also visited the extraordinary museum, which is in the Franciscan church, the Chiesa di San Francesco, as it's called in Italian, built by the Franciscans between 1335 and 1338. This was actually the third Franciscan church in the Montefalco area. There had been two others prior to this, but they were outside the walls. As of 1335, the friars minor are able to have a church built inside the walls. In 1863, which is 3 years after the unification of Italy, which takes place in 1860, the church becomes the property of the city of Montefalco. And as of the end of the 19th century, 1895, it is the Museum of Montefalco. Attached to the church is the former Franciscan convento. We remember that in Italian, convento is the lodging of the friars, and monastero is the lodging of the sisters, so it's just the opposite. And in this convento now, there is the delightful museum, and we're going to learn more about that. And it's important to note that as of 1860 and the unification of Italy, we must realize this. There's what's called demaniazione. That is de-domaining. We must remember that Umbria, Abruzzo, Marches, Lazio, all these regions of central Italy were papal states. As of 1860, they're part of Italy. So what happens? In a town like Montefalco, let's just say this, imagination. We have 10 churches. Well, it's decided we don't need 10 churches. We're going to keep 5 open. The others are closed. What happens to all the art in those churches? They enter into the museums, the artworks, and they become property of the Italian people. You see? So this is taken away from the Franciscans and it's given to the people. Think of places like the Vatican Museum, the National Gallery of Umbria, etc., the Uffizi. What are they filled with? Art that was taken out of churches when churches were closed at the time of the unification of Italy. Many times, not always. You enter into this church museum, and you can see here it was set up for a meeting recently. It's absolutely an extraordinary space. There are frescoes here on the walls, different ones. We're going to talk about many, done between the 14th and 17th century. And as Bruno Toscano, great art historian, says, they're frescoes of pious initiatives. What does he mean? This fresco here of a saint was probably commissioned by someone and paid for by a pious person devoted to that saint. So this was a church filled with many, many frescoes. It was all frescoed at one time. And sometimes the frescoes were superimposed over each other as new commissions would come along. But certainly the highlight of this museum is the apse area with the astonishing frescoes of Benozzo Godzilli from Florence, who frescoed here between 1450 and 1452. And frescoing in Montefalco, he is now a maestro indipendente, meaning he is working for himself. Benozzo Godzilli was known by Fra Jacopo, a Franciscan, when he was in Rome, because Godzilli was working there with Beato Angelico on frescoes in the Vatican, in the Sistine, not the Sistine, for the papacy in the Vatican. Benozzo Godzilli worked with Beato Angelico also in Orvieto. And this Franciscan friar, when he was in Rome, was so attracted to the work of Godzilli that he commissions him to come to Montefalco. So this is his first commission, which is his commission. He's not the assistant to some great artist. He is the great artist himself. One of the frescoes, and there are many frescoes here about the life of St. Francis of Assisi, and we're going to be talking about various. One of them, which is right about here, depicts on the left the Sermon to the Birds. There's Mount Subasio, backdropping Assisi. This is Assisi, up on the hill. This is Spello. This is Bevagna. The great art historian Elvio Lunghi of Assisi said the gifts of Godzilli were his capacity to depict with elegance personages and depict with realism landscape and combine them together into a harmonious unity. Very talented was Benozzo Godzilli. So here we have the Sermon to the Birds, and over here we have Francis, another scene. He's preaching and he's praying and he's blessing the city of Montefalco. And kneeling here, we have Fra Jacopo, who is the Franciscan who came into contact with his work in Rome and commissions him to come to Montefalco. This is another Franciscan. This is Fra Marco, and Fra Marco was a bishop, and he's taken off his bishop's mitre. He's holding it as if to say to Francis, I am not worthy before you. He's kneeling, and he takes off the sign of a bishop here, the symbol of the bishop. And then we have two citizens of Montefalco. This is probably a city magistrate. We know that with his elegant headgear. And this might be the committente. That is the person who commissioned the fresco. They often have themselves put into the fresco, the person who commissioned it. Now I'm going to show you a detail of the 13th century wall of Montefalco because it's most interesting. This is the St. Augustine Gate that Pino and I entered when we went to the Enologica in Montefalco. And this is the Church of Sant'Agostino here. Now, there is a symbol on the wall, and that symbol is 3 hills topped by a falcon. And this symbol will become the stemma, or the coat of arms of the city of Montefalco, although it's modified over the years. And the peregrine falcon is now striding over 6 mounds. I talked to one of the young women at the museum today. Thank you, ladies of the Museo di San Francesco, for all your help on this talk. We've been talking on the phone almost daily. They're absolutely astounding, the young woman working at the museum. And the young woman I talked to today said, we really don't know why it modified into 6 hills rather than 3. But we know why the falcon is there. The falcon is over, 2 falcons are over the 13th century city gate of Montefalco, mid-13th century, called Porta Federico II, Frederick II. Frederick II was grandson of Frederick Barbarossa, feudal emperor, Holy Roman Emperor. It's said that he was baptized in the Cathedral of San Rufino, where Francis and Clare were baptized. He lived some of his childhood in Assisi, and it is said that he often came to Montefalco to hunt falcons. Therefore, the town is known as of 1244, I believe, mid-13th century, as Montefalco. Prior to that, its name was Cocorone. It was a Roman city. The name is Roman. And there were probably people on this hill prior to the Romans, this native Italic people called the Umbria, as early as the 5th century BC. But the town is Cocorone until it is rebaptized Montefalco, the Mount of the Falcons, in 1244, because of the love of Frederick II to hunt falcons in the area around Montefalco. Godzilli frescoed in the Church of San Francesco, which we're talking about. But it wasn't his first commission in Montefalco. His first commission in Montefalco was in the Franciscan monastery called San Fortunato. San Fortunato has a long history, but anyway, I'd like to talk about it more amply, probably in another talk on Montefalco. But briefly, it originates probably in the 4th century. It could have been originated on the site of a pagan temple, an early Christian church. By the 5th century, a basilica is built here as an ex voto, thanks for favor received. That is by one of the patron saints of Montefalco called San Severo. Later, Fortunato is buried here. He is an early Christian saint of Montefalco. He was actually a humble farmer who used to pray in the grottos around here. He lived, I believe, in about the 5th century AD. Between the 8th and 9th century, San Fortunato becomes the first parish church of Cocorone, as it was called then. By the 14th century, Frederick II, it's already a rocca, probably built by Frederick II in the 13th century, and it is a fortress or rocca in the 14th century. And amen, finally by the 15th century, it becomes Franciscan. It's given to the Franciscans. And over the doorway, Benozzo Godzilli, frescoes the Madonna and Child between Francis of Assisi, Bernard of Siena, the choir of angels above them. Now, where is this fresco? Let me show you. This is entering San Fortunato right here over the doorway. So this is Godzilli's first Montefalco commission. His next one is the splendid church of San Francesco. So did he enchant the Franciscans that Brother Jacopo wishes him here to fresco the apse of the Franciscan church. He frescoes 20 episodes in 12 different scenes in 3 registers, these sections, these vertical sections, working with his assistants. And right over the pergola, this is called, the pergola was put up in the 1500s, right over the pergola, and I want to see if I can move this down, is this important fresco right here. This is Francis in glory. This is not God. This is not Christ. This is Francis of Assisi in glory. And this is carrying out the theme of the Franciscans. It's very sacred to Franciscan spirituality, this concept of Francis as the alter Christus, the saint who most lived his life like Christ. The Franciscans are the first to tell you, however, we're not comparing Francis to Christ in Christ's divinity, but in his humanity. And over the pergola inside the arch are portraits of the first 12 followers of Francis of Assisi. Now, the first episode in Montefalco of the life of Francis is his birth, not in Assisi, as some of you may remember. In Assisi, the first episode is the cloak laid down by the simpleton so Francis can walk across it. This is medieval art. This is Giotto, the school of Giotto, late 13th century. Now let's go back and look at Godzilli, Renaissance art. Notice the medieval dress. Notice the medieval architecture. We're just developing the sense of three-dimensional perspective. And then this is Godzilli. So this is, let's see, early 1300s. This is 150 years after Assisi. The first episode that Godzilli depicts is the birth of Francis. And the story says, legend wishes that he could have been born in a stall. Actually, they say a pilgrim came to his mother shortly before the birth. This is supposed to be Christ disguised as a pilgrim saying, if you have your child in a stall, he will become great, no harm will come to you. So this is the first fresco, is the birth of Francis in a stall like Christ. The personages on the bottom, there are 20 of them. They're important Franciscans. There are 2 Franciscan popes. This is one. Nicholas IV. Those of you who've been in Assisi may remember that he is the one who had the monastery built adjacent to the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi, Franciscan Pope. This is the Holy Roman Emperor, Constantine. He was Giovanni of Brienne, French, and 1228, he was present at the canonization of Francis in Assisi. He asked to be buried in Assisi, and he was buried actually in the lower basilica, and he asked to be dressed in a Franciscan tunic because he'd taken his vows before his death. Robert d'Anjou, the Angevin French. He is king of Naples, and he takes his vows as a Franciscan in 1337, just before his death, and he too is buried in a Franciscan church, that dedicated to St. Clare in Naples. That's a church not to miss. Naples is not to miss. So here is the Assisi episode. Notice the difference with Godzilli's Renaissance episode. Francis here is welcomed by a simpleton in this scene. And he's walking down a medieval street, and the architecture, this is all Renaissance architecture. And then we switch to Assisi, medieval. And this scene is in Assisi. This is another medieval fresco, very, very late 13th century, attributed to the school of Giotto. Francis hopes to join a crusade, leaving from Spoleto, heading down to southern Italy to join Giovanni di Brienne. And he leaves the city of Assisi, meets a poor knight, excuse me, and gives him his cloak. On the hill is the Benedictine monastery of San Benedetto, which was closed for restoration. It just recently opened, so we can now visit it. Periodically, it's open for visitors. Now, this scene is depicted by Godzilli in Montefalco. Francis meets the poor knight, gives him his cloak. He's in full Renaissance dress, an elegant prancing horse. He hopes to join a crusade. He's taken ill with fever in Spoleto. The Lord appears to him in a dream and shows him a palace. It's the Palace of Florence, Palazzo Vecchio, also called Palazzo della Signoria. And here we're depicting actually the conquest, symbolically, the conquest Francis will have following the Lord's call. And we have an interesting Franciscan down here. This is Duns Scotus. He was Scottish, lived in the mid 14th century, professor, philosopher, and one of the greatest medieval theologians, ranking right up there with Thomas of Aquinas and Saint Bonaventure, first biographer of Francis of Assisi, or one of the first biographers of Francis of Assisi. He was beatified by Pope John Paul II in 1993. Okay, this is Duns Scotus, Scottish. An active Scottish community, Franciscan. Imagine that, mid-century. But actually the Franciscans were in England, and a monastery was there 2 years before his death by 1224. So think of the evangelization and how quickly it went on. This is the scene in Assisi of the renunciation of the earthly inheritance. Francis will strip himself naked, throwing his clothes back at his father, saying, Pietro Bernardone, you are not my father, only God in heaven is my father, with God's hand. His brother Angelo probably trying to hold back the father. Wait a moment, Papa. Let's think this over. And the Bishop Guido covering him up. Now, what I'd like you to notice here are the two little girls. It said they had stones in their apron. They were going to make fun of this kind of idiot who's going around preaching poverty. Godzilli must have liked it. He did this scene in Montefalco, and there's the little girls with stones in their aprons. And people in full Renaissance garb. And really taken to the max, because his brother now has a mink collar around his cloak. And very elegant is the cloak of the bishop. Elegant is the gold brocade covering up Francis's nakedness. And here we have a beautiful, beautiful Renaissance city. Also depicted in Montefalco is the first living nativity, when it said that Francis creates a living Christmas scene in 1223 in the city of Greccio. And we've done a talk on that, Christmas traditions in Assisi. We talked a lot about Greccio. This scene, art historian Elvio Lunghi from Assisi believes, was set in Brunelleschi's Basilica of San Lorenzo, recently built in Rome. And here we have a scene not in the Assisi Francis cycle. Francis meeting St. Dominic in front of the Vatican Basilica in Rome, both going there to ask permission to preach and to form their monastic orders. And this is yet another Franciscan Pope, Alexander V. This is biographer Saint Bonaventure with his cardinal's hat. This is the scene of the death of Francis of Assisi. It said actually he wished to die naked. He was laid on the ground in front or near his little Porziuncola chapel. We talked about that in my talk, Assisi Outside the Walls. You may remember that as of the 16th century, they built the huge Basilica of St. Mary of the Angels over this little Porziuncola. This fresco is 1450 to 1452, so the Basilica of St. Mary of the Angels had not yet been built. And the splendor of this fresco cycle by Godzilli is absolutely astounding. One will want to visit many times. On my last visit, I noticed for the first time these three personages here. Okay, all these 20, the other ones, all 20, are Franciscan personages. Not these three. These are lay personages. One is Petrarch, the greatest Italian intellectual, says art historian Elvio Lunghi. The inscription here calls him monarch of all virtues. Another is Dante. The inscription describes him as theologian, expert of every science. The third personage is Giotto. Godzilli esteemed him very much, and the inscription says he was the most esteemed among Italian painters. And before you leave this chapel, you want to look to the left, and in a glass case to the left is the letter of Godzilli. This has only been on display, I think, for the last few years. This is a letter that Godzilli wrote in 1452 to a noble Florentine who wished him to come to Florence to do a work for her, to commission him for a work. And Godzilli replied that he could not come because he had not yet completed his work in the church of Montefalco, in the Church of San Francesco. So thank you, mille grazie, Benozzo Godzilli, for having said no to that Florentine and stayed long enough to finish the work. Now, in this church, there are extraordinary artistic works besides the Godzilli frescoes, and many related to Franciscans. And of course, there is the symbol of Bernard of Siena, the IHS, his monogram, also called trigram by some, Jesus hominum salvatorum. It said that he held it up before he preached, always starting his sermons saying, Jesus Christ, Savior of mankind, and calling the people to peace and reunion together. And he would draw in the crowds. His objective through his sermons was to unite the faithful in the name of the Lord. And in fact, in Perugia, they built a pulpit outside the cathedral when he came to preach. There's one in Assisi. It's an outdoor pulpit because when he preached in Assisi, I believe it was 1425, the crowds came. He preached in Perugia about the same time. He preached in Montefalco in 1426. And when he preached in Montefalco in 1426, he reconciled the quarreling locals, and according to local legend, and tradition, to seal the pacification he had brought about, he left them this plaque, this wooded gold leaf. Godzilli did another fresco in the same church. It's in one of the side chapels, and Bernard of Siena appears in this one. This is a side chapel dedicated to Saint Jerome, and he is right here, Saint Bernard of Siena. He's also in the predella, the lower part, along with another Franciscan saint here. Montefalco saint. The frescoes are superimposed in this church, as is not uncommon in medieval churches. Bruno Toscano, great archaeologist, writes this: the result of the devout pressure of various individuals or collective parties who often canceled out one another's initiatives. This was sponsored by a pious person named Jerome. So the motif he wishes are episodes of the life of Saint Jerome. His name was Girolamo, and he was an esteemed Montefalco citizen. Named Girolamo. But it's also important to know that Fra Jacopo, who was the Padre Guardiano, or the head of the Franciscans, when Godzilli was in Montefalco, was very, very devoted to Saint Jerome, and he belonged to the Confraternita di San Girolamo in Perugia, the Brotherhood of Saint Jerome. Bernard of Siena is here. Bernard of Siena is here. And he's also painted on the arch, which divides the chapel from the nave of the church. Here's the nave. This is the Godzilli fresco cycle of St. Francis that we talked about. And we also will be talking about this stunning crucifix. Here's Bernard of Siena, and here he is enlarged a bit for you. We always recognize him because he was bald and toothless. And, you know, people had seen him. They could paint his portraits almost. We don't have portraits of Francis of Assisi. And he's always has his finger up raised because he's preaching. He's telling us something. He's calling the people to restore the rule of poverty, which his founding father had preached. Another fresco in this church, it's a wooden panel painting, which I find absolutely delightful, is this one. La Madonna del Soccorso by Tiberio of Assisi. Painted on wood. Again, here, pious desires to commission art. The person who paid for it is a Griseda di Sebastiano, and that is in the inscription on the bottom, and she's having it done for her family members. The mother of succor or rescue is a preferred medieval image. And this is, they say the story is this: an impatient mother, here she is, had said to her naughty little child or capricious child, "May the devil take you." And the devil did. And in great remorse, she prays to the Virgin to save her child, and the Virgin is ready to club the devil. Now let's zero in on this mother. Forgive me for what I did. Holy Mother, save my child. Here is the child. Look at the stunning gold brocade of her garments, and the devil pulling the child away. And some art historians believe that the Madonna is actually Franceschina, who was a member of the family of the woman who commissioned this. Here's the devil. He's a hybrid of animal and human figures in his face, and in his body parts, but he has a snake around his waist and the wings of a bat and so forth. There's another Our Lady of Succor or Rescue in the Pinacoteca, because behind this nave is the entrance to the civic picture gallery of this museum, and it's absolutely extraordinary and full of extraordinary artworks. Now, we want to talk also about this crucifix right here. We're going to see it here. And this is one of the most important works in this church. This was painted in tempera on molded wood in the late 13th, early 14th century by an artist called the Maestro Espressionista di Santa Chiara. The painter with great expression of St. Clare, because a cross like this is in the Basilica of St. Clare in Assisi, same period of time. And this photo is thanks very much to the young women at the Museum of San Francesco, the Maestro Espressionista. Now, do notice the extraordinary drapery work, typical of the textiles of the time. And here I'm pointing up to note that kissing the feet of Christ is Francis of Assisi. And this is an example of, or a clear evidence, that is, that the cross was commissioned by the Franciscans, who wanted Francis depicted at the feet of Christ. This once hung over the main altar, and it hung over the main altar, as I believe, as of the 16th century. Then it was moved to the side. So the Impressionista. And we can't leave the Museo di San Francesco without alluding to the marvelous Perugino fresco of the Nativity on the back wall. This was done by Perugino in the early 16th century. This is his wife, Chiara Fancelli. As of 1494, she was always his model for the Blessed Virgin. He married her. I think together they had 3 sons and 2 daughters. Perugino was not from Perugia. His name was Cristoforo di Vanucci, and he was from Città della Pieve, but made his fame painting in Perugia and area. And behind is always an Umbrian scene. This is Lake Trasimeno. Now, after we satiate ourselves with art, we're going to satiate ourselves with good food. Because if you come out of the Museo di San Francesco, go down these steps and look this way, you will see, wait a second, a delightful little restaurant where I recently ate on my Montefalco tour with Anne and Fred, and what a surprise. This little trattoria is called Locanda del Teatro, and I was mystified. The inn of the theater, but it's not near the theater. And later I found out from one of the co-owners, who I knew, when he had the inn, the 2 of them, Paolo and the chef Pasqualina, once cooked here. This was called the Inn of the Theater. It's on the main square, and it's right next to the theater, the Teatro di Montefalco. There's just a section of it here. It's very close to City Hall, 13th century City Hall, Palazzo Comunale of Montefalco, with a 15th century portico. But they moved down the street. The name came with them, and they're in this fascinating building, which was once the carriage house of this noble palace on the right. And this is the indoor dining area, and there were stairs leading up, so when the nobility got out of their carriage, they could take the stairs up into their home. And their home is called Palazzo Camilli, and you can see the stairway leading into Palazzo Camilli. Now, it's a very delightful restaurant, and along the wall under the stairway in the hot summer weather, you can eat very coolly right in this corridor here, created under the access to the main palace. Well, Paolo came out to say hello, and I had last seen him some years ago at the old Locanda del Teatro, and he was there with great cheer, joyous, happy to welcome us, and I complimented him on his outfit and his lovely bow tie, and he pulled it down for us, and he said, "I'm glad you like it, it's made of wood." He had a wooden bow tie, and he welcomed us with a little dish that is called the Welcome Smile. And he told me that the Welcome Smile can change every day depending on the creativity of the chef, Pasqualino. Our Welcome Smile was vellutata tiepida di patate e cavolo viola con crostini di pane. Ours was warm cream of velvet soup of the potatoes of col fiorito and purple cabbage with little crusts of bread. It was absolutely delightful. And Fred is having, I'm pretty sure he's having Sagrantino wine here with this meal. So in the kitchen is Pasqualino. He's co-owner along with Paolo, and I'm just going to share something with you in a minute here. Paolo sent me this photo, and I called him, and I said, it looks to me like Pasqualino in that photo is making gnocchi. Well, this is what Paolo told me. Let's hear if you can see.
Esatto, Anna, confermo, sta facendo l'impasto per gli gnocchi di patate rosse di col fiorito, fatti a mano. Lui fa dei rotolini lunghi e poi li taglia regolarmente e si squagliano in bocca. Perfetto, Anna, tutto chiaro. Ciao, ciao.
So that, can you turn that off? So that is Paolo saying precisely, Anna. Those are gnocchi of the red potatoes of col fiorito, which he'll roll out into a long roll, and he cuts them into little cubes, and he said at the end, that melt in your mouth. With great passion. I mean, the food absolutely astounding, delightful, served with great pleasure and great passione. This is the ambience. We were eating outside. This is the old carriage house transformed into an indoor restaurant. That's the kitchen. The kitchen, all glass, so that you can go at any time and watch them cooking through the window here. And here are the first things we had. I ordered a pasta dish, which you'll see in a minute. Fred ordered his incredible gnocchi. And Anne had ordered, I think she had stuffed zucchini flowers with ricotta. But here's Fred's gnocchi. And I just want to tell you how they're made. Let me just see a second. I've got to take off my glasses. Yes, made with the potatoes from col fiorito, and the sauce is made from sun-dried tomatoes, marjoram, and buffalo mozzarella cheese. And this is my pasta dish. Bottoni con pollo arrosto. Buttons with roast chicken, red sweet peppers, and rosemary crumble. I hope everybody's getting hungry. It's almost lunchtime. And then out came the surprise. Paolo said, he told us, I have them today. They were brought from me from somebody who found them on the mountains, shaved white truffle, which was served to Fred on poached egg. There you are. Fred had a smell first, a little whiff. And this was Anne's choice. She didn't have a pasta dish. She had two actually antipastos. This antipasto was carpaccio of finely smoked duck breast with sprouts and wild berries. Is that not creative and absolutely lovely to look at? And she said it was as delicious as lovely to look at. I ordered an antipasto, which was pistachio-encrusted chicken liver pate with Sagrantino poached pear sauce. And I had almost forgotten to take a picture of it. And I took a little bit. I thought I'd forgotten to take one. I did take it as it arrived, and I took one as halfway done, too. And we shared together the dessert. Varona dark chocolate pudding made with olive oil and fresh red fruits. Varona dark chocolate is French, and I believe it was first produced in the 19th century. And there are Fred and Anne enjoying, and this is the menu here. And I hope someday you can join me in Montefalco. As we were leaving, and we'll have a bite to eat here, as we were leaving, young Dalila was serving that we were enticed by, but absolutely too full to eat. It was a parmesan of the dark celery of Trevi, which is especially celebrated in October. So this dish is being just served for about a week. And I want to thank Pierpaolo Metelli for use of his photos. He doesn't like to lend his photos very much. He jealously guards his photos, but he sent me 3 photos, and I thank him very much. And this is one of his photos as well of the beautiful Umbrian hill town of Montefalco. May this photo entice you to join me soon here in Montefalco. The Balcony of Umbria, celebrating fine wines, textiles, and Renaissance majesty.